Imagine waking one morning to discover that the world you trusted has quietly vanished. Not in fire or thunder, but in silence, as if the heartbeat beneath your feet simply stopped during the night. And this was the reality faced by the people of Britain in the early 5th century, a land that for 400 years had lived inside the comforting machinery of Rome. A world of schedules and stones and systems where roads ran straight as arrows across hills and marshes, where heated villas glowed against cold rain, where coins bore the familiar faces of distant emperors and carried with them the promise that order still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. And yet one day that promise dissolved, not with a declaration or a farewell, but with unanswered letters and empty forts. And to understand how the Anglo-Saxon story truly begins, you must first sit with that silence and feel its weight. Because Britannia at its height was not a forgotten edge of civilization, but a deeply Roman place where aristocrats reclined on mosaic floors depicting dolphins and gods they had never seen, where Latin echoed in basilicas, where bathhouses steamed with gossip and politics, where underfloor hypercausts whispered warmth through stone, and where the rhythm of life followed Roman calendars, Roman laws, Roman taxes, and Roman expectations, binding Britain to a vast empire stretching from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania. But empires, like all living things, depend on circulation. And when the blood stops flowing to the extremities, the fingers grow cold first, and Britain was Rome's farthest limb, useful, profitable, but ultimately expendable. And as pressures mounted along the Rhine and Danube, as emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, legions were pulled away like stitches unraveling from an old garment, first with Magnus Maximus in 383, then with Stilicho in 402, then again with Constantine III, each withdrawal leaving behind thinner defences, frayed confidence, and a growing realization among the Romano British elite that the imperial hand they had relied upon might never return. And as raids from Picts, Scots, and Saxons intensified, the illusion of permanence cracked. Villas, once symbols of security, became liabilities, cities hollowed as trade faltered. Coins disappeared from circulation as if money itself had lost faith in the future. And when the desperate appeal reached Emperor Honorius in 410, and the reply came back telling Britain to look to its own defences, it was not an act of abandonment so much as a confession that the world had changed beyond repair, that Rome could no longer be Rome even to itself, and in the vacuum that followed, life did not instantly collapse into barbarism, but instead shrank inward, becoming smaller, harsher, and more local. Power pooling in the hands of regional strongmen who clung to Roman titles, Roman memories, and Roman dreams while ruling over a landscape that no longer supported them. And this fragile moment, this breath held between worlds, is where history blurs and legend begins, because across the grey waters of the North Sea, other peoples were watching. People shaped not by stone cities, but by wood and weather. Men and women whose lives followed tides and seasons, whose loyalty was to kin and chieftain rather than emperor, and who saw in Britain not the ruins of Rome, but opportunity. Fertile land weakened by division, and when the Romano British leaders, desperate to defend what they could no longer control, invited these warriors as mercenaries, believing they could be managed, paid, and dismissed, like Roman auxiliaries of old, they misunderstood the nature of the age they were living in, because Rome's systems had vanished but Rome's habits remained, and trusting contracts without enforcement, promises without legions, was a fatal error. And so the first Saxon ships did not arrive as conquerors, but as guests, stepping onto a shore already heavy with loss. And from that moment onward, the silence left by Rome would be filled, not by restoration, but by transformation. Slow, violent, uneven, and irreversible. And Britain would begin the long, dark, and fascinating journey from Roman province to Anglo-Saxon England. A journey not marked by a single battle or date, but by generations learning how to live in a world after the empire had gone to sleep, and as those first mercenary bands settled along the eastern coasts, their presence at first seemed manageable, even useful, because the Romano British world had already learned to live with soldiers who did not quite belong, or auxiliaries drawn from distant provinces, men who spoke other tongues, yet fought under Roman command. And so the newcomers were given land instead of pay, space instead of silver, because coinage had already thinned to memory. And in this arrangement we can sense the last reflex of a dying system trying to imitate itself. But these Saxons, Angles, and Jutes were not fragments of an empire. They were seeds of something new, entire communities arriving with families, customs, gods, and ambitions. And when food shortages came, when promises went unmet, when leadership faltered among the Romana British warlords who had neither the authority nor the infrastructure to enforce their will, friction became conflict, and conflict hardened into something older and darker than Roman law, something governed by feud, retaliation, and survival. And this is where Gilda's furious account of betrayal and burning cities finds its emotional truth, even if the details blur, because archaeology reveals not a single wave of destruction, but a patchwork of collapse. Some towns abandoned peacefully, others violently scarred. Some regions holding on to Roman ways for generations, while others transformed almost overnight. And beneath it all runs the quiet tragedy of cultural amnesia. As Latin literacy fades, as stone buildings give way to timber halls, as Christianity retreats in some places while new pagan rituals take root, not because people chose to forget Rome, but because memory itself requires institutions to survive. Schools, courts, roads, and when those vanish, remembrance becomes fragile, passed only by word of mouth, vulnerable to distortion and loss. And yet, even in this so-called Dark Age, there is movement, adaptation, and continuity, because the incoming peoples did not erase Britain, but absorbed it unevenly, intermarrying, adopting place names, learning the land's rhythms, while Romana British communities either retreated westward into Wales and Cornwall or slowly blended into the new social order, leaving behind echoes in language, law, and legend. Whispers of Arthurian figures who may represent the last flickering shadows of Romanized war leaders fighting against inevitability. And as generations passed, the identity of the island shifted almost imperceptibly. Children growing up who had never seen a bathhouse, never used a coin, never spoken Latin, for whom Rome was not a memory but a myth, a name attached to broken walls and stories told by elders whose own grandparents had lived in a different world. And it is here that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms begin to coalesce, not as an organized invasion force, but as organic responses to power vacuums, with Kent, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria emerging from networks of kinship, conquest, and settlement, each shaped by geography as much as violence. Rivers becoming borders, forests becoming refuges, coastlines becoming gateways to the wider North Sea world. And in this transformation we must resist the temptation to see decline alone, because while Roman Britain fell, early medieval England was being born, carrying within it a different logic, one suited to a world without centralized empire, where loyalty was personal, law was customary, and power rested in the ability to protect, feed, and reward followers, and those stone cities crumbled. New centers of life emerged in halls warmed by hearth fires, where poetry was spoken rather than written, where history was sung rather than inscribed, and where identity was forged through shared hardship rather than imperial citizenship. And so the silence after Rome was not empty for long, it was a pause between chapters, a long exhale in which Britain shed one skin and slowly grew another. And if you listen carefully, beneath the later noise of kings, monasteries, and battles, you can still hear that moment of quiet. That eerie stillness when an entire civilization stepped away, leaving its people to decide day by day how to live in the ruins of certainty, and it is from that uncertain ground, neither fully Roman nor fully Saxon, that the medieval world of England ultimately rose, shaped not by the grandeur of empire, but by the resilience of ordinary lives adapting to a landscape where Rome had gone, and nothing quite like it would ever return. And yet, even as this new world took shape, the shadow of Rome never fully disappeared, because ruins have a way of lingering, not just in the earth, but in the imagination. And across the English countryside, broken walls, collapsed bathhouses, and overgrown roads stood like ghosts of a forgotten order, their original purposes slowly misunderstood, repurposed, or woven into folklore. And for the people living among them, these remnants were not archaeological curiosities, but features of the everyday landscape, places of shelter, danger, superstition, and memory. And it is within this layered environment that early Anglo-Saxon culture developed its unique character, pragmatic, resilient, and deeply aware that stability was never guaranteed. And while the old Roman towns emptied, power migrated toward defensible positions, river valleys, hilltops, and fertile plains where communities could sustain themselves without distant trade. And leadership became inseparable from generosity, because a king was only as strong as his ability to feed and reward his followers. And so wealth shifted from coin to cattle, from taxes to treasure, from bureaucratic salaries to rings and weapons distributed in the mead hall, binding warrior to lord through loyalty rather than law. And this social structure, so alien to Roman sensibilities, proved remarkably suited to the fractured political landscape left behind. And yet beneath these new customs lay a population far more mixed than later myths would suggest, because archaeology increasingly shows continuity rather than replacement. Fields still ploughed by descendants of Romanra British farmers, old boundaries respected, local knowledge preserved, and even language itself absorbing Latin words quietly into Old English, evidence of contact, coexistence, and gradual blending rather than total annihilation. And the violence that certainly occurred must be understood not as a single catastrophic event, but as centuries of instability where power was constantly renegotiated. And in this environment, Christianity, which had once spread through Roman administration and urban centers, struggled to survive, retreating westward while pagan beliefs flourished in the east, until missionaries returned centuries later, not to a land of total spiritual darkness, but to one where belief had adapted just as society had, merging old gods with new ideas, sacred springs with Christian saints, and Roman memory with emerging English identity. And when literacy finally re-emerged in monasteries, it did so selectively, preserving fragments of the past through the eyes of those who lived long after the events. Men like Gildas and Bede, who wrote not as neutral observers but as moral interpreters, framing the fall of Rome as divine punishment and the rise of the Anglo-Saxons as both catastrophe and destiny. And through their words, the silence of the 5th century was given narrative shape, filled with meaning, blame, and purpose, even as much of the lived reality remained forever beyond recovery. And it is this tension between what was lost and what was created that defines the true legacy of Rome's departure from Britain. Because the end of empire did not bring an end to life, only to a particular way of organizing it. And from that ending emerged a society that would eventually produce its own kingdoms, its own laws, its own literature, and its own sense of belonging, rooted not in imperial citizenship, but in land, lineage, and shared memory. And so, when we trace the origins of Anglo-Saxon England, we are not witnessing the birth of something from nothing, but the slow, often painful transformation of a world, learning how to exist without the structures it once depended on. And in that long twilight between Roman order and medieval England, we find a story not just of invasion and collapse, but of adaptation, endurance, and the quiet determination of people who woke each day in the ruins of an empire and chose, somehow, to keep living, and over time, that act of simply continuing became the foundation upon which new identities hardened. Because children born into this shifting landscape did not measure their world against Rome, but against the realities in front of them, the safety of their kin group, the strength of their lord, the fertility of the soil, and the stories told beside the fire at night. And these stories mattered more than laws carved in stone ever could, because they explained who belonged and who did not, who was owed loyalty and who was an enemy. And in a land where written records had all but vanished, memory became power, guarded by poets and elders whose words carried history forward in fragile human form. And it is here that we see the deep importance of oral tradition in early Anglo-Saxon society, not merely as entertainment, but as a social glue, binding communities together through shared ancestry, heroic deeds, and cautionary tales of pride and ruin. And although the Roman past faded from practical use, it lingered symbolically, sometimes as a golden age remembered imperfectly, sometimes as a warning of arrogance, and sometimes simply as a landscape of strange ruins attributed to giants or forgotten peoples. And meanwhile, the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued to expand and collide, driven as much by competition among themselves as by resistance to the remaining Brittonic realms in the west. And this constant pressure ensured that warfare remained a central organizing force, shaping settlement patterns, fortifications, and political alliances. And yet, even warfare followed rules rooted in custom rather than imperial command, with compensation, oaths, and blood prices structuring conflict alongside violence, revealing a society not without order, but governed by a different logic, one that valued honor and reciprocity over abstract authority. And as these kingdoms stabilized, trade slowly re-emerged along new routes, linking Britain not to Rome, but to the North Sea world, to Scandinavia, Frisia, and beyond, creating a cultural orientation that looked eastward rather than south. And this shift would have profound consequences for the future, aligning England's development with the rhythms of Northern Europe rather than the Mediterranean. And still, the legacy of Rome surfaced in unexpected ways, in the reuse of old roads that stubbornly refused to disappear, in the siting of churches near former villas, in administrative divisions that echoed Roman boundaries long after their origins were forgotten, and perhaps most importantly, in the idea, preserved faintly but persistently, that Britain had once been part of something larger, something ordered and something universal, an idea that would later inspire kings and churchmen alike as they sought to rebuild unity through new means. And so the so-called Dark Ages were not dark because nothing happened, but because the light of written history dimmed, leaving us to reconstruct the past through fragments, soil stains, and echoes. And when we do, what emerges is not a sudden plunge into chaos, but a long, uneven dusk, where old certainties dissolved and new ones formed slowly, shaped by necessity rather than design. And in that dusk, the Anglo-Saxons did not merely replace Rome. They inherited a land already transformed by absence, already adapted to survival without empire. And it was this inheritance, forged in silence and uncertainty, that allowed England to become something distinct, neither Roman nor barbarian, but a culture born from the space left behind when the greatest power the ancient world had ever known quietly stepped away, leaving ordinary people to decide what came next, one field, one hall, one generation at a time. And as centuries rolled forward, that inherited uncertainty slowly hardened into tradition. Because what begins as adaptation eventually becomes custom, and the choices made in the shadow of Rome's absence set patterns that would endure long after the memory of why they were made had faded, shaping how authority was understood, how justice was delivered, and how community itself was defined. And this helps explain why early English kings ruled not from marble palaces but from itinerant courts, moving from estate to estate, consuming surplus, reinforcing bonds in person, because power was something that had to be seen and felt rather than assumed. A lesson learned in a world where distant authority had once failed catastrophically. And even when writing returned through the church, it did not resurrect the old Roman bureaucracy, but served new purposes, recording land grants, saints' lives, and genealogies that traced royal legitimacy back not to emperors, but to heroic ancestors and mythic founders, grounding rule in lineage and divine favor rather than imperial appointment. And this blending of memory and myth created a powerful sense of destiny that would later be projected backward, turning the messy reality of migration and survival into cleaner origin stories of conquest and replacement, stories that simplified the past in order to stabilize the present. And yet beneath these narratives, the land itself continued to speak of continuity, field systems plowed along ancient lines, rivers retaining Roman names beneath English tongues, and communities living atop layers of history they only partially understood. And perhaps this is the most haunting legacy of Rome's departure from Britain, not the collapse itself, but the way it trained generations to live without guarantees, to expect change, to rely on local bonds rather than distant promises. And this mindset would resurface again and again in later English history whenever central authority weakened or transformation loomed, echoing that first great silence when the empire left. And so, when we look back at the Anglo-Saxon beginnings, we are not just witnessing the aftermath of Rome, but observing the birth of a cultural resilience forged in abandonment, a society shaped by the knowledge that even the greatest powers can vanish, leaving ordinary people to rebuild meaning from fragments. And in that understanding, there is something quietly universal, because the story of Britain after Rome is not only about the past, but about how humans everywhere respond when the structures they trust dissolve, when certainty evaporates, and when survival depends not on grand systems but on adaptability, memory, and the will to continue. And as the night deepens and the noise of the modern world fades, this ancient story invites us to rest with that truth, to recognize that endings are rarely final, that silence is often the space where something new gathers strength, and that from the quiet left behind by Rome's departure, an entirely new world slowly learned how to speak. And even as that new world learned to speak, It did so in a voice shaped by loss as much as by possibility, because the memory of collapse lingered like a cautionary tale encoded into behavior rather than text, teaching communities to distrust excess, to value flexibility over permanence, and to understand that survival often depended on cooperation at the smallest scale. And this may explain why early English society invested so deeply in kinship ties, oath swearing, and personal loyalty, systems that could function even when wider structures failed, and why betrayal was remembered with such intensity in legend and lore, because trust, once broken, could unravel everything. And through this lens, the stories preserved from this era, fragmented though they are, take on a deeper meaning, revealing anxieties about order and chaos, about good kings and bad rulers, about the thin lines separating protection from exploitation, themes that echo across centuries because they were forged in a time when the consequences of failure were immediate and brutal. And as landscapes slowly healed, forests reclaiming abandoned towns, animals grazing over buried mosaics, life went on in ways both humble and profound. Children growing up unaware that the stones beneath their feet had once warmed bathers or echoed with laden debate. And yet those stones still shape paths, boundaries, and imagination, silent witnesses to a vanished certainty, and in this way Rome never truly left Britain. It dissolved into it, becoming part of the soil, part of the unconscious inheritance of those who followed. And so the Anglo-Saxon story, when viewed not as an invasion narrative but as a human one, becomes a meditation on transition itself, on how cultures end not with a single moment, but through gradual forgetting, and how new identities emerge, not fully formed, but through countless small decisions made under pressure. And perhaps this is why the period continues to fascinate, because it resists simplicity, refusing to offer clean heroes or villains, presenting instead a world in flux, where survival demanded compromise, resilience, and imagination. And as we drift further into the quiet of that distant age, it becomes easier to sense how disorienting it must have felt to live without the certainty of Rome, to wake each day unsure whether the old ways still mattered or whether something entirely different was required. And yet out of that uncertainty came continuity, culture, and eventually a new sense of belonging, proving that even when empires fade into silence, humanity does not, it adapts, remembers, and carries forward, reshaping absence into foundation. And this long, quiet transformation, unfolding over generations rather than moments, stands as one of history's most profound reminders that what appears to be an ending is often only the beginning, spoken softly at first, in the hush left behind when the world you knew steps away and leaves you to listen for what comes next. And listening for what comes next is exactly what those generations were forced to do, because without imperial signals to follow, without edicts, paydays, or reinforcements arriving from across the sea, decision-making became immediate and personal, grounded in seasons, harvests, and threats that could be seen from the hilltop rather than imagined in distant capitals. And this sharpened awareness of the present moment shaped a mentality that prized practical wisdom over abstract theory, a way of thinking that would later surface in English law codes, poetry, and proverbs, all reflecting a deep understanding that life was uncertain and that stability, when it came, had to be actively maintained, and in this environment leadership was constantly tested, because a lord who failed to protect or provide would quickly lose followers. And so authority remained fluid, negotiated again and again through action rather than inherited assumption. And this constant renegotiation of power meant that the political map of early England was never fixed, kingdoms rising and falling, merging and fragmenting, names appearing briefly in history before fading back into silence, leaving behind only earthworks, burial mounds, and scattered references in later chronicles. And yet even these ephemeral polities contributed to a growing sense that the island was no longer a Roman province, but something distinct, a land of many peoples gradually learning to imagine themselves as sharing a future, even if they did not yet share a name. And over time, the memory of Rome shifted from lived experience to symbolic reference, invoked by churchmen as a model of unity, by kings as a source of legitimacy, and by storytellers as a distant age of wonders, its true complexity flattened into legend. And this mythologizing was itself a sign of distance, because civilizations only become myths once they are no longer part of daily life. And so, as England slowly took shape, it did so atop layers of reinterpretation, the past constantly rewritten to serve present needs. And this process, begun in the silence after Rome, would continue throughout history, reminding us that what we remember is often as important as what actually happened. And as night deepens and the mind drifts, this long unfolding story invites a gentle reflection, not on conquest alone, but on continuity, on how people persist through uncertainty, how cultures transform rather than vanish, and how silence itself can be fertile ground, a space where the noise of one world fades so that another can slowly, quietly, begin to form. And in that forming world, the pace of change was slow enough that no single generation ever felt it entirely, because each child inherited a reality already adjusted to loss, already accustomed to making do. And so what might appear from a distance as dramatic collapse was lived on the ground as gradual narrowing, fewer options, shorter horizons, but also clearer priorities. And this narrowing shaped values in subtle ways, encouraging communities to measure success not by expansion or grandeur, but by survival across winters, by the strength of kin ties, by the reliability of allies. And this recalibration of meaning is perhaps one of the most enduring consequences of Rome's departure, because it reoriented society away from universal ambition and toward local endurance, a shift that would echo through centuries of English cultural development. And even as later kingdoms grew more powerful and Christianity spread again with its written word and continental connections, the lessons of the post-Roman world remained embedded, visible in the suspicion of distant authority, the emphasis on customary law, and the deep attachment to land and locality. And when monasteries rose amid the ruins of villas and forts, they did not erase the past, but repurposed it, turning abandoned stones into places of prayer, memory, and learning, quietly stitching together fragments of Roman knowledge with new Christian frameworks. And through these institutions, the silence of the 5th century was slowly given voice, not as a detailed record of events, but as a moral narrative about loss, sin, endurance, and renewal. And yet even these voices spoke from distance, interpreting rather than witnessing, because the true experience of that transition lived and died with people who left no written trace. Farmers, craftspeople, children, and elders whose daily decisions shape the future more profoundly than any chronicle ever could. And it is their invisible labor, their quiet persistence, that forms the hidden spine of the Anglo-Saxon story, reminding us that history is often carried forward, not by those who write it, but by those who endure it. And as the centuries unfolded and England gradually emerged into clearer historical light, the memory of Rome became a background presence. No longer a blueprint, but a reference point, something to compare against, to invoke, or to surpass. And this long relationship with absence, with a greatness that had been lost before memory could grasp it, gave English history a particular tone, reflective, cautious, and deeply aware of impermanence. And so when we trace the beginnings of the Anglo-Saxons back to that moment of departure, we are not merely identifying a cause and effect, but entering a meditation on how societies respond when certainty dissolves, how silence reshapes imagination, and how, from the quiet aftermath of empire, new ways of being slowly, patiently take root, growing not through command, but through time, until one day the silence itself becomes history, and the world that replaced it feels inevitable, even though it was once born from uncertainty, loss, and the simple, stubborn act of continuing on.